want to start the lecture by asking you to move back in time to Germany in 1952. As you know, many German cities were heavily bombed, including Frankfurt. And Frankfurt, you can see in 1952, the old town, the houses are still destroyed. The population suffers from malnutrition. Many people are homeless and don't have a roof over their head. And there's a public health crisis because of the Second World War and the immediate repercussions of the war. Now, Frankfurt 1952 is also the city where a young woman who was 19, her name is Heidi Simon, lived. So Heidi Simon was born in the year when Hitler came to power in 1933. All her childhood and her youth she spent in fascist Germany, and then the Second World War, 6 years of the Second World War. In 1952, the American Marshall Plan organized a photography exhibition to win over young Germans to democracy and liberty. And the categories reflect the hardship and poverty at the time. So you had categories in the photo exhibition which said bread, not war, housing, better food, things like that. Heidi Simon was one of the lucky winners with her photograph, and she received a letter from the ministry saying, "We congratulate you on your wonderful photograph. You win second prize. You get several hundred marks or dollars, and you get a Vespa moped." Heidi Simon wrote a response to the ministry, which survives in the files in the Federal Archive, and she said, "Thank you very much. I'm pleased I won the prize. I don't want to be impertinent or bad, but instead of the Vespa moped, let's see, can you rather send me the Lambretta moped? Because the Lambretta is much more fashionable and elegant. And all last year, I've been dreaming of having the Lambretta moped." Now, you all had your experience with bureaucrats and administrators, I'm sure, so you can imagine the old men in the administration receiving the letter saying, "We've just offered you money and a moped, and you write us a letter saying you'd rather have something professional. Who do you think you are?" So they said, "No, you don't get it." Well, why is this an interesting story? It's an interesting story because we are at a time in a society which is broken. And the houses are in rubble. And here's a young woman who says, "I want something more fashionable than what you're offering me." And Vespa is not bad, you know, it's not a bicycle, it's still a motor roller. And it's an interesting story because it runs counter and contradicts a very, very popular and widespread idea which many people associate with the American psychologist Abraham Maslow, which is called the pyramid of needs. Maslow, interestingly, formulated his theory exactly at this time. And for Maslow, people and societies always advance from basic needs, food, housing, health. Once they are fulfilled, they move up the pyramid. They may want sociability, entertainment, and then comes fashion, and then at the top, if you're rich and developed, then comes luxury. But here we are in Frankfurt, and Heidi Simon wants something fashionable, even though the society in which she lives is poor, has problems with basic health, clean water, things like that. So if Maslow had been right, Heidi Simon should have written in her letter, "Thank you, you're offering me a Vespa, but actually, could I rather have fresh fruit, vegetables, some brick or roof over my head?" But she didn't. So there's something wrong with the assumption that people advance from basic needs to desires. So what I want to do in the rest of the lecture is problematize the old account and then introduce what I think is a better account and a more truthful account of why and how societies have become consumer societies. Now, to help us with this, it's a good idea to bring out John Kenneth Galbraith, the most influential economist after the Second World War, born in Canada but active in the United States. And Galbraith, in the late 1950s, wrote what remains the best-selling, most influential book on the subject, called The Affluent Society. And what Galbraith wrote there was that the United States, for the first time in history, has produced a new kind of society, which he called the affluent society. And he saw it as a break with everything that had been there before that time. Now, there were three elements of the affluent society which Galbraith said were new and typical. The first, he argued, was that it is a society based around markets. So desires and wants are all satisfied through private choice in a competitive marketplace. And he used the car as a typical example. Cars are made by companies, people go and buy them in a marketplace, and he said the second element of that is that things are consumed through private choice. People choose these objects. It's not regimented by the state or so, it's individual desire. The third thing he said was that in this affluent society, individual choice and private desire will win out and displace the public interest. It's a famous quote he had, private luxury amidst public squalor. So the idea was that the more people exercise their private choice, they will buy a Cadillac like this, air-conditioned inside, radio, you can listen to the song what you want, but you're driving through a city which is in public squalor. And he had these images of rivers steaming with chemicals, schools collapsing, hospitals not having any funding, because he said in this affluent society, all people are thinking about is their own private satisfaction. And citizenship and community become subordinate or secondary. So there are several things for us to remember with this account. The first is that he argued that this demand, desire for consuming, he said, is radically new. It comes after the Second World War. It comes only in a society like the United States, which is rich and prosperous. And consuming, he said, is all about private choice and markets at the expense of the public good. So that's the standard account. And we have a big problem immediately, because if you go into a museum or into an archive, you suddenly find a lot of what are consumer goods from centuries before the 1950s. And I've just selected here a few examples to give you a sense of just how much consumption there already was in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. This doesn't like me. There. So take our first example. This is a porcelain bottle, very fine, as you can see, fine glazing with a picture from Yingdeshen in China. Yingdeshen is the center of porcelain making. They produce in 1600 every year many hundred thousands of these bottles. So this is not an elite item. You can find bottles like this in the graves of farmers and artisans, very widespread in China. And it takes Europe 2 centuries to come up with something similar. And so here we have an example from Wedgwood from the late 18th century. An Italian example from the Renaissance is this plate, which is a Majolica plate, so it's not porcelain, but it's glazed with a drawing underneath. This plate was part of a service of 125 items. Yeah, so it's not just one plate, you have to imagine lots of these plates, cups, etc. And then down here, a Latin American example is a Machi silver cup with a bombilla. And I don't need to explain to you why there is the bombilla. Europeans always think, oh, bombilla, and then you share it. But I partly put it here because what holds all these 4 objects together is that they're not consumer goods that are simply about private choice. They're about sociability. It's about people getting together. Consuming is about sharing, having a party, a tea party, or a matcha tea party. And we have accounts from travelers in the Andes saying, oh, these local women, they're spending all their money on fine silver matcha cup and bombilla. What's wrong with them? They should spend it on food or better food. But no, they want that. The same criticism you see in Europe, people saying, oh, these English ladies, they're spending all their time in a tea party. You know, that's frivolous and so forth. The point here is this is about community. It's not about private satisfaction. And what these objects show us is that a first wave of consumption already happening around 1600. Yeah? So it's not, we think, oh, it's after the Second World War. If you had lived in 1600, you would think, wow, all these things, you know, we have many more things than our parents or grandparents. And you have literature, poetry, criticism about this demand of things at the time. So where does it come from? Where does this wave of consumption come from? And why have we not understood it or seen it? Now, there are several structural factors. Urbanization is very important. People consume more in cities, and for obvious reasons. If you wanted to open, say, a churrascaria, well, would you do it in the middle of nowhere, in the state of Rio, or would you do it in Copacabana? Well, if you're a businessman, you go into where there are lots of customers. So restaurants, shops, marketing, advertising, all these things cluster in cities, and it just so happens that Holland and Great Britain, the two most advanced consumer societies in the years around 1700, 1800, were also the most urbanized places on the planet. So by 1700, more than 1 in 3 people in Holland and England live in a sizable city. Nothing like this before in history. If you live in a city, it's likely that you don't know all your neighbors. Yeah, it's a big city, it's more anonymous. You may have come from the countryside because you want to start a business. Why does this matter? It matters because a lot of consumption is about communication and status. So, if you come from Yorkshire and grew up on a farm, you move to London, you will need credit, you will need to rent a house, you will need business contacts. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to leave your countryside clothes and you try to dress to signal, I am a trustworthy, credit-worthy, serious business person. Yeah? So you consume not just because of who you think you are, but because of what you want others to think who you are. That means more consumption. And we can see in these cities, in the century after 1700, the emergence of what we would now call the fashion system or the fashion industry, with different seasons, with the first advice books saying, it's January, you should dress with this hat, not that hat. That hat is last year. This hat is new. It's the new way of signaling you have style. You have the first fashion dolls appearing, and so forth. The second structural factor is trade. Many of these objects increase in number because they circulate on the oceans. So by 1700, Holland and England import porcelain from China. In the case of tea, you have a boom in tea, also coffee and chocolate, because you have European empires that control plantations and that control the mercantile trade. This is again not private choice and not markets. These are state-dominated, regulated monopolies, yeah, that bring back the chocolate and bring back the coffee. And I think there's no argument that without state power, Europeans wouldn't have been able to get their hands on chocolate and coffee because they required plantations and they required slaves, and to get the slaves there, you needed the slave trade, and no private business, this did not make sense under private business conditions. You wanted a monopoly that allowed you to control the trade for 20, 30 years without any risk. But just as important as these structural factors, I would argue, is a cultural transformation. And Fatima, I apologize for my pronunciation, you said it much better, but it's EU material. Is that? EU material. So the material self. Since ancient times, so think about Plato, but also the early Christians like Augustine and others, there was an assumption that there was a divide between the human self, the spiritual self on the one side, and the material world and objects on the other side. And the ancient philosophers and the early Christian writers were full of warnings of what happened if people allowed objects to become too important in their lives. So for Plato, it meant people, if they lusted after fashionable carpets or sofas, they would become so comfortable that they wanted more and more and more luxuries. How do you get these luxuries? Plato said only through war. So war, expansion, empire. Plato said this is evil. It means people no longer care about the pure self and perfecting their ego. They went out into the world to destroy. And similarly, the early Christians argued that too many fancy objects of fashion distracted believers from doing what they should be doing as Christians, which is praying, reflecting on their sin, and trying to reach God. So things were temptations and needed to be controlled or restricted. And this, no one questioned this. When women tried to have fashionable clothing in German towns in the 16th, 17th century, they were thrown in prison. That was just how it was. Why would you want to walk around the street in a fashionable scarf? You're making other people more tempted to buy fashionable goods. They should be in church or at home. So punish them. And then something happened in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, and writers, philosophers, business people, scientists started to question this idea of the spiritual self versus the material world. Businessmen, merchants, returned from their journeys with new objects and new foodstuffs. So a good example is the armadillo and nutmeg. Do you know what nutmeg, the little nut you use for cooking? Yes. Muscada, very good. In German, Muscat. Muscada. Europeans did not know, what is this? Merchants brought it back and exhibited it like in a museum, and said, we must investigate. There are things out there in the world we did not know about. This is good. It's not something bad. We should investigate. What is it? This muscat nut. What can you do with it? Oh, perhaps it has medicinal properties. It can heal, as well as you can put it in the food, and it can be spicy and so forth. So businessmen, merchants said, actually, the material world is full of knowledge, and it's bad to ignore it. We should let it into our lives. We should investigate. So those were the merchants. Then come scientists. Famous British scientist Robert Boyle, probably the most famous scientist in the 17th century. He wrote a lecture in which he said, lots of people say we should look away from things. Why? He said, this is quite wrong. The critics say, oh, it's bad, God does not like it. So Boyle said, but God made the world. God created different continents with different plants, different animals, different raw materials. Surely God wanted us to find out about the world. Otherwise, why did God make it? So Boyle concluded, instead of keeping things away, actually, we should embrace them. That's the way to honor God. You're finding out about God's great creation. So it was not only all right, but it was a good Christian, legitimate thing to consume more. And then came the philosophers and people we now call economists, like David Hume and Adam Smith. Hume said, some some people in the past said that if you pursue luxury goods, you're actually creating poverty and instability, because the rich take the luxury and then they leave behind the poor. But Hume said that's quite wrong. If people want fashionable objects that always change, then they have to be produced. To produce new objects, you need new technology. New technology needs new knowledge. So actually what you do is you create productivity. And more productivity means more economic growth. So Hume concluded, you're actually a good citizen to want comfort, convenience, and what he called modest luxuries, because you're creating work for others. And as there's more money coming in, the government will be richer. And a richer government can defend itself militarily more easily. I don't have to, if I'm rich, we don't all have to join the army. I can just hire an army. You can enjoy yourself. We have enough money to hire mercenaries. So Hume said, actually, we should have a more positive attitude towards luxuries. And Adam Smith, his pupil, concluded in his Wealth of Nations in 1776 that consumption, he said, consumption is the sole end or purpose of production. And what he did, he had turned it around. People before Smith said, wealth is created through production. Smith said, nonsense. You need someone to want to consume these things, otherwise it wouldn't be produced. Yeah? So consuming is actually helping everyone around. And the climax of this new way of thinking about the self and the material comes in the 19th century, and I've put up a quote here from William James, the most important psychologist and philosopher in the United States in the late 19th century, the brother of Henry James, the novelist. And William James, in a very, very interesting section, talks about the different layers or dimensions of the self. And he says, we know people have a psychological self. We know people have a social self. We have friends, we have parents, we have children. But he said, that's not all. And he coined a new phrase that he called, we also have a material self. He said, all the things we own, if we have a boat, our clothes, our books, our furniture, at our house, all those things are part of who we are. Now, you could be a cynic and say, well, yes, people have a house, yes, people have a car, people have a nice dress or coat, but why do we need this new term, the material self? It's still something separate. There's the chair, and there am I. Well, William James pointed out that people who lose possessions, say a fire, or burglary, theft, or you become bankrupt, and the courts send someone to your house and say, I'm going to take this chair, I'm going to take this silk scarf. Yeah? He said, many people who are in a situation like this, they feel as if they lose part of their body. These objects are part of who they are, who we are. Clothing is actually a very good example because of our tactile sense. Something like people have estimated 90% of what we feel every day is textiles. We're rarely naked. We always have this. And we all have, I'm sure, a favorite dress or a favorite shirt because the way it feels and the way it folds, and when we walk, it feels natural to us. So James said, we do not exist as humans in a vacuum. We are humans because we have objects and we use objects. And it's very simple, because if you took this computer away, or this pen away, and the paper away, I would just be sitting here speculating in my head. We would live very different lives. And James pointed out how much of our life depends on things. Yeah. So there is something called the material self. And so in the 16th to 19th century, we have the old assumption, the old cultural way in which people looked at the world, gradually being replaced by a new outlook, an outlook where the human self and the material world overlap. They're not separate. And it's good people say that they overlap. It makes us richer people. Daniel Miller, the anthropologist, a few years ago, did a study of a single street in London where he looked at people's homes. And he found huge variety. Some people had lots of objects. Some people had virtually no objects. And very interestingly, the people without objects were the most miserable, sad, depressed people. They had the fewest connections to the neighborhood, to sociability. They were so withdrawn, they were like monks. Yeah. So things are, if you want, bridges to other people, to the rest of the world. So far I've talked about social factors and cultural factors and the way in which people look at things. But equally important is a second transformation which concerns how people think of themselves as consumers, not just as people, but as consumers.